All right. Before I begin, I will email the exam to you about 12:30. Shortly, a few minutes after the class is over. I will not be holding office hours tomorrow for the obvious reason that I cannot answer any questions pertaining to the course while you are doing the take-home exam. The instructions on that exam are very clear. So please, before you send me a query about when it's due or what the format is, just make sure you read the instructions. It's very explicit, very clear, no room for confusion. And as I've mentioned before, you'll get 3 questions and you have to answer 2 out of those 3 questions. One of the questions is mandatory, and from the remaining 2 you pick 1. So essay questions, you're going to answer 2 of them, and roughly 2 to 3 pages for each answer. All right, double spaced, use Times New Roman 12, and make sure that you proofread the exam before you submit it to me. It's due in class on Thursday at 11 a.m. when I come in. All right? Any questions? Yeah.
Is there a Turnitin link as well?
Sorry?
Turnitin.
No. I don't believe in using those kinds of technologies because I think the presumption there is a student is being dishonest in a way, which is, I think, an assumption that I don't agree with. So I'm just expecting all of you to be completely honest about it. But you do not use Turnitin, you just simply turn the exam in to me. That's all. You do turn it in, but you turn it in to me. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about the, yes?
Is there a minimum word limit or page limit?
Well, I think you need a minimum of 2 pages to answer each question. I don't believe that you can adequately answer it, but there's no upper limit. Although I suspect that if you have, a little bit less than 48 hours to write the exam, and assuming that you have other classes and you're going to sleep, I don't think you're going to be writing much more than 3.5 pages, even if you wanted to. But you don't really need more than 2.5 pages to answer each question. Yeah. All right. I think the exam, as you'll see, it's actually it's really straightforward, simple. And it's a take-home exam, so if you haven't done the readings, but you do have to reference some of the readings, but again, the questions will make that clear. You have quickly time to, try to do that before you answer the questions. Any other queries? All right. Did you have a query? Yes.
Is there a specific format for citation that you would prefer?
Specific format, meaning?
Or like AP style or
Oh,
MLA?
no. This is, you just, the instructions will make it clear. If you're quoting Said, you just say Said, page 25. That's all. I know what readings you're using. If you're using outside sources, which I recommend you do not do so, because it'll distract you. You have enough material from the syllabus to answer the questions, but if you use outside sources, then you must give me the full citation. I don't care which method you use. Yeah. All right. Any other queries?
I remember I asked you last week if we could use the History Writing Center. I was just wondering if you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad you reminded me. I think the answer is no. Because the thing is that inadvertently, what they're going to help you with is what they can help you with is the structure. But if you were doing a paper, I certainly would have no objection whatsoever. In fact, I would recommend that you use them if you were writing, let's say, even a 5-10 page paper. But for this, I think the answer is no. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and I also want to emphasize that we are absolutely, by the end of the lecture today, we'll be absolutely on track. Okay. So this is week 6, lecture 1. Just look up week 6 in the syllabus, lecture 1. Which says the social life of the British in India. I'm going to end with that today. The first half of the lecture today, I'm going to continue from my previous lecture. But the social life of the British in India is not that complicated a subject in a way. So, we're going to finish with that and we'll be absolutely on track. And then for the lecture on Thursday, we're going to move to the events of 1857, 1858, which is the Great Rebellion, the end of the company officially. But we'll, of course, start by looking at what was happening in the 1830s, 1840s very briefly and recapitulate some of the main things before we move to that. However, turning to the subject of the conquest of knowledge, which is something that I've been speaking to you about. What I had been doing in my previous lecture, as you might recall, is I had essentially been going through the various kinds of modalities which had been enumerated by Bernard Cohn. And as I mentioned to you before, it's not an exhaustive list, but we had considered what it means to speak about, for example, such things as the survey modality. What was the role of mapping, cartography? We talked about the enumerative modality. We spoke about the linguistic modality, the creation of grammars and dictionaries, the classification of languages, why the British thought it was essential to have a command over these languages, how they instrumentalized some of that, right? And this is the last one that I've been speaking to you about the creation of what you might call the museological modality. What is the nature of the museum? What kind of body of knowledge does it embody? Now what I want to do is I just want to go through the remaining two, including the surveillance modality. And the surveillance modality is obviously something that was in some sense a much more expansive kind of modality, because one of the things that the British are charged with doing, or at least that's what they think of their role in India as being one of the fundamental principal elements of their role, namely to maintain law and order. Now, to maintain law and order, you obviously need to keep a watch over the population. You must have a sense of their movements. Right? If there is unrest, you must be able to put it down. You need a system of spies and informants, right? So forth and so on. Right? And so this is what I mean when I speak about the surveillance modality. The notion of the panopticon. The panopticon is this, it's something that is associated with Jeremy Bentham. Bentham is one of the founders of utilitarianism, you might recall, and the panopticon is a reference to a particular mode of surveying, where, for example, if you look at jails in the United States, they're largely based on this idea of the panopticon, where you cannot see, the jailer, but the jailer can always see you. Right? So, and there was this particular kind of jail called the cellular jail, which was developed in the Andaman Islands as well. This is where the British sent political prisoners. When I say political prisoners, I do mean political prisoners. That is, that there are people who the British already in the first half of the 19th century view as people who are opposed in some sense to British rule in India, and these people are being classified as political prisoners. This category, of course, is going to pick up in a very substantial way when nationalism becomes a potent force. Right? One of the things that I talk about in my introduction, so one of the readings that you had for this whole section is my introduction to a book which is The History of Railway Thieves. It's a rather odd sort of book, you might say, but in fact this was part of a series of books that were produced in British India. So here, these railway thieves were people who were viewed as thieves who specialized in working on the railways. And we haven't got into the introduction of railways in India. We'll talk about that later on. But by the 1840s, 1850s, the railways had been introduced in India, and then what the British found over a period of time was that there were people from their point of view who were specializing in working on the railways as thieves. So these are people who are called railway thieves. And it's in that connection, in part, as I point out in my introduction, that fingerprinting was invented in India. Okay, so if you look at histories of fingerprinting, you'll find that it's usually mentioned in most of them that fingerprinting first was invented in India, and that's a long and complicated story, part of which I talk about in my introduction. Yes.
What was the purpose of fingerprinting?
I'll tell you what the purpose was. So let's supposing you are a young man, and let me just give the person a name. The person is called Mohan, and he's apprehended by the British at a railway station, engaged in criminal activity. Right, so he's stolen a purse from a lady. And the young boy, he's 18, 20 years old. The cops catch him, the police catch him. They give him a slap or two and say, well, just make sure that you don't engage in this behavior. We're letting you off with a warning. All right? I don't engage in this behavior again. Now, a month later, the same boy, except that now he's going by the name of Balu, right, is caught again. And it so happens to be that it's the same police officer on that route. And he says, yeah, you know, this boy looks familiar, but, you know, they check the records and they don't have anyone going by the name of Balu in their records. And in any case, they hadn't taken down the information because, remember, this boy had been given a few slaps and then let off. And so now Balu is apprehended. He looks a little bit like, he looks vaguely familiar to, you know, Captain Richard Wright. You know, let's call him, that's the name of the official. Okay. And so, you know, he gives him another beating and says, well, you know, don't engage in this behavior again. Right? Not because these thieves are going under aliases, so they take on a different name. Now, 6 months later, he's apprehended again, and he's called Pinky. By the way, they do use such names. You might think that's not, you know, right? So he's called Pinky. And now the British are, this official is beginning to think that, you know, look, I mean, this guy looks really familiar to me. I mean, you know, but I just can't put my finger on it. All right? I just can't put my finger on it, as it were. So what are they thinking about? They want to find a way which is foolproof for being able to identify criminals. And that's going to be, because if it's the same man every time, and you know, 2 years later, this guy has been apprehended 8 times under 8 different names. Well, how do you establish it's the same person? Well, one of the ways in which you establish it is by coming up with a foolproof system. And the foolproof system, which is used down to the present day. Of course, now we know that there's DNA testing and all of that. But fingerprinting, you know, when you apply for citizenship, they take your fingerprints. When you enter the United States, unless you're a U.S. citizen, you always get fingerprinted. You know, right? So forth and so on. It is still the method that is used. Right? And there's a very interesting story which complicates it enormously, because remember, one of the major elements of this narrative that I have talked about, I've hinted at it continuously, it's a subject unto itself, and that is that, you know, the person who is credited as being the translator of the text, the person who is the inventor of a certain system, is always a Britisher. But they were always Indians working behind the scene. And one of the stories about the invention of fingerprinting, well, what made the British think that fingerprinting may be, in fact, the foolproof method? And so one of the things that I found when I was working in the archive was that, you know, you'll have to shift your register of mind a little bit here for a second. So one of the practices in India that you found, particularly in the state of Rajasthan, was a practice called Johar. Johar is collective suicide by women when the enemy is at your door. When the enemy is at your door. So you know the Mughals and the Rajputs were engaged in conflict, and when it was apparent that the Mughal army was going to take over a Rajput stronghold, the Rajput women would all jump into the well and commit suicide. All right? And that's called Johar. And they would do that in order to avoid, obviously, the humiliation that is usually reserved for women in these times of war, i.e. rape and sexual assault. Yeah? And that's not something peculiar to India. This is the common story all over the world. All over the world. I mean, if you know what's happened in Bosnia in the 1990s, what happened in the Rwandan genocide in 1994, or what victorious American soldiers did to German women at the end of World War II. Rape is the way in which, one of the ways in which you inflict your dominance over another culture. You rape their women. So to avoid this now, to avoid this sexual assault or the threat of rape, when it was quite apparent that they were going to lose, these women would commit suicide. And what is the connection with fingerprinting? Before they would walk into the fort where they would commit, they would, so there are these clay huts, as it were. They would put their hand there. If you go there, you can still see. And one day, a British police official is sort of, going around these forts, and he looks at these imprints of these hands of these women and says to himself, they all look quite different. We all look that, you think that, oh, the impressions all look the same, but he just happens to be looking at it all these imprints look actually very different. The rings on your finger, of course, then you have to put it under a telescope to look at it microscope to look at it very carefully and all of that. But that's one of the stories about how fingerprinting came about. As I said, it's a very long narrative, a very long narrative, but the use of fingerprinting is related then, to the question of apprehension of criminals. Because first you have to be able to identify a habitual criminal. And of course, this was also going to be, if you look at the last item, the enlistment of photography, this is another thing that photography would do. But in the 50s, 60s, photography is not widely being used. It's already there. It's come in. We have photographs, for example, of India, 1857, 1858, during the mutiny, during the Great Rebellion. Right? But it's still in a rudimentary stage. And then gradually we're going to find that photography is also going to be enlisted. So you'd have a photographic record of this habitual criminal. But then again, the problem there is that the transmission, the photographs, the guy might be operating in 20 different areas. And so you're going to have that photograph. What they did was they basically created a central database. So the use of these central databases, this is something that you're going to find widely in use in India beginning in the 1860s in particular. All right. Now, the maintenance of law and order is always a central aspect of administration, whether it's colonial style administration or whether it's administration under a democratic regime. Right? This is one of the mandates that the state arrogates to itself, and in fact, actually, there's a widespread notion in every society that the state has the responsibility for maintaining law and order. And so, one of the things that the British created was a department called the Elimination of Thuggee and Dacoity. And again, an extremely long story. You've heard the word thug, of course, which is widely used in English. It's an Indian word, right? And the thugs were people who worked essentially on the highways. So they were roadside stranglers. And there's a huge literature on the phenomenon of thuggee, but it had some kind of, at least according to one dominant view, it had some kind of religious sanction. It had some kind of religious sanction, so there was a ritualistic way in which you actually, killed an innocent traveler. So you're a traveler, you stop at a wayside inn at 11 p.m. And then the thugs might deprive you of your money, so forth, and your jewelry, and these were the people who were called thugs. But thuggee, again, there's a very interesting set of questions about, well, how long had it really existed? Was this a phenomenon that was confined to a part of India? Many of the thugs were known to be followers of Kali, the goddess Kali. Is it the case that these thugs increased vastly in numbers in the 1820s and 1830s, owing to, as we shall see when we move to the whole section on economy, right, owing to severe dislocations in the economy, to the fact that there was now a kind of a groundswell of unrest, particularly agrarian unrest. Right? There's always a relationship between what is happening in the economy as a whole and the rise of what you might describe as criminal activity. And that remains true again down to the present day. But to some extent, I'm going to suggest to you that the British emphasis on thuggee and the role that they played in putting down thuggee has to do with their fear of the wanderer. Okay, so these thugs were also people who were not settled. If you want to think about it, I'm not saying this is a perfect analogy, but think about the enormous unease that you always find in European society. France is a spectacular example of that. And the enormous unease generated by gypsies. Right? Because who are the gypsies? Again, these are people who generally will not settle down in one place. In fact, one of the other names by which they're known is travelers. They're also known as travelers. Right? They move from place to place. They're itinerant. People who are itinerant do not respect borders, for example. Right? So they're anxieties that are generated. And I'm saying that there was in fact a kind of an anxiety generated by these thugs. There were some who were undoubtedly engaged in criminal activity, but you find that British literature tends to, I would say, overemphasize the number of thugs, to what extent they were operating. And one of the ways in which they eliminated, so the elimination of thuggee becomes a great heroic narrative. In what the British are doing, right? And one of the ways in which they eliminated was they obviously put in informers, right? So people who were actually British police officials who tried to infiltrate these systems. And part of the surveillance modality, so the elimination of thuggee and dacoity, this was a special department actually created by the British, but more generally you have to think about the creation of the Indian Police Service. And here I want to make an observation which is true not just of the Indian Police Service, but is true in general of colonial rule. That is that in many ways India was a laboratory where the British tested out certain kinds of social theories before they applied these theories back in England itself. The Indian Police Service is the best illustration of that, because in many ways the Indian Police Service was much more advanced than the equivalent in England, that is the Metropolitan Police Service, for example, in London. And many of the methods of crowd control. How does one control crowds? Right? I mean, if you're interested at all in the history of policing, these are central issues that exist down to the present day. If you know what happened in Ferguson a couple of years ago, the question always is, well, how do you control a crowd, particularly when the crowd starts to get larger and larger and starts to get, quote, unmanageable? Well, these techniques of crowd control were first perfected by the British in India. Right? The use of rubber bullets, as they're called, first used in India by the British. Right? The particular way in which the police service was centralized, again, tested out by the British in India, and then they're going to take their experience back home in England. So you have to think of India as a social laboratory as well, under colonial rule, right? And then there were these, you can this has not been put in any systematic order, because when I speak about boutique criminals, I'm really talking about, when I say boutique criminal, that's my own phrase. I'm talking about people like railway thieves, a special class of people who are working only on the railways. And the British had this idea, which is that, and this is going to actually become a part of the whole surveillance modality, the whole regime of surveillance. They had this idea that there were people in India who were actually part of what they call criminal castes and tribes. So if you were born into a certain caste, you were a criminal by birth, by definition. Right? It was supposedly part of your genetic inheritance, so to speak. And what were the consequences of being a member of the criminal caste? Your prospects for employment or livelihood were greatly diminished. If indeed what this did was it ensured that these people would continue to be part of this group and would continue to engage, quote, in criminal activity because all other doors were shut. So if you belong to a certain caste, that caste has been notified. Notified means that there is an official gazette, and you have been put your name, the name of your caste has been put on that list, on that gazette, as a criminal caste. Right? So you go seek employment. You're a young man, 18 years old, 20 years old. You go look for employment. They're going to first check and see, is your caste a criminal caste or not? If it is, you don't have any prospects of employment at all. Right? This is what I'm really speaking about. So there's a kind of a circularity, because what the notion of criminal castes did was to, in fact, actually perpetuate the idea that certain people, right, are criminals by birth. Criminals by birth. And there were other consequences, such as a person who was a member of a criminal caste, if he were to travel outside the area where that caste was typically confined, that person would need special permission. He would then have to go and enroll at a police station, so forth and so on. All right? So this is what I mean when I speak about the surveillance, modality. And finally, let me move into the last. And then I'm going to try to offer some sweeping observations of a different kind. The anthropological modality. Right? The anthropological modality was essentially an enumeration along anthropological lines or ethnological lines of different groups in India, and these were classified by caste. The British view was that caste was a peculiarly Indian institution. I think many scholars would agree, although even on something as basic as that, there is actually a fundamental difference of opinion among some scholars whether we should think of caste as a peculiarly Indian institution. We know that the word caste is used often in other contexts. For example, it was used in much of the literature having to do with slavery in the American South. All right? And I can give you numerous examples of that. George Fitzhugh would be a good illustration of a scholar, a polemicist who actually used the word caste often when describing slavery in the Deep South in America. Right? And some people have suggested that apartheid, South Africa under apartheid, before South Africa ceased to be an apartheid state after Nelson Mandela became the first president of Free Republic of South Africa, that apartheid was in fact a kind of a caste system, right? So there are people who have made those kinds of observations. The British view was that caste was a peculiarly Indian institution, and that caste should not simply be viewed as a form of stratification. Now, when I say stratification, what I mean very simply is that there are different strata to which people belong, right? So class is a system of stratification. It's a system of stratification. We think about the lower class, the middle class, the upper class, and then of course within each of these you could say there is the lower upper, the middle upper, the upper, so forth and so on. You can keep on making these distinctions, right? And we know that in a system of class, at least in principle, there is mobility. You could be born a pauper and you could become a billionaire, in principle, right? The British view was that caste is not a system of stratification. There is class in India, so no one's denying that there is class in India as there is in every society, but that in addition to class, there was caste. And that caste is in fact a system of hierarchy, right? And in a system of hierarchy, there is no mobility. So this is, I'm not suggesting to you, by the way, that this is my own personal view of it, but this was a view that became quite firmly established. The classic expression of that is not actually a British scholar, it's actually a French scholar, Louis Dumont, who wrote a book called Homo Hierarchicus, which is basically on the origins of the caste system in India. Right? But these are some of the considerations. And even though, for example, Dumont is writing in the 1950s, right, what he's doing is he's going back to the ethnological ethnological or, quote, anthropological record created by the British in India. And when I said the anthropological record, what I'm talking about is these massive studies that started to come out, which started to enumerate all of these different groups. Right? So one of the persons who does that is a man called Risley. And he's going to be the director of the Ethnological Survey of India. He's also going to be director of census operations in India. Right? And there's an overlap here between this and the enumerative modality, because the same person, Risley, who is kind of the chief anthropologist or ethnologist in a way, he's also the director of the census. Right? And what is a census doing? What it's doing is it's actually creating these categories. Right? I've discussed the census to some degree with you before. He's creating these categories by which Indians are now going to be classified, enumerated, demarcated, divided. Right? That's what the census is doing. And there is an overlap here. So essentially, if you look at the anthropological modality in totality, what are we talking about? What we're talking about is an attempt to try to understand the totality of Indian society through categories such as caste, tribes. Right? And we can, by the way, we can, we don't have the luxury of being able to do it, but just so that you can think about it, what do we mean when we speak of a tribe? For example, very often when you speak of African society, even today, many people will speak of tribes, but nobody speaks of tribes in Europe today. Not today, maybe during the time of the Goths or the Franks, perhaps, right? But certainly not today, right? So we're going to have to understand what the use of these categories was, right? And the anthropological modality is a modality which, as I said, attempted to bring the totality of Indian society demarcated according to various systems of classification under the purview of the British, partly in order to be able to, quote, better understand the people that they were governing. But there were certain kinds of distinctions that are important. So if you turn your attention to the last couple of elements in this slide here, one of the things I've suggested before is, and I'm going to dwell on this for just a moment, is that there are two simultaneous processes at work in this modality and in the British classification of India as a whole. What are these two processes? One is a system whereby you essentially keep on splitting things. Okay? I want you to keep in mind, by the way, there are a number of scholars who have argued that if you look at scholarly work, when scholars, whether they're anthropologists or sociologists or historians, when they look at societies, they have a tendency to think about difference, or they have a tendency to think about similarity. There are people who are interested in saying, well, people are fundamentally the same everywhere. We can try to understand, different societies, but we can say that, there are certain conceptions that are common, right? And these conceptions that are common are more interesting. These are the people who are called the lumpers. They lump everything together. And then there are the people who are known as the splitters. The splitters. You keep on splitting. Right? You keep on splitting. Now these are, in a manner of speaking, the two tendencies that you see at work in India simultaneously, and colonial India in particular, except that here the splitting and the lumping is taking place in a highly exaggerated fashion. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, when you look at these studies of caste, it's not sufficient to say that, there are 4 castes in India. Right? There are the Brahmins, there are the Kshatriyas, there are the Vaishyas, and then the Shudras. No. What you do is you split each of these, and you keep on splitting them. So you come up with thousands of sub-castes. And of course, one of the things the British was going to argue was that this shows that there is no conception of Indian unity at all. So, when nationalism becomes a potent force, starts to become a potent force, The British are going to say, what's in common between this particular subcaste of the Shudras and this particular subcaste of the Brahmins? There's nothing in common at all. We are the ones who bring some kind of unity to India. Right? That is the principle of what I'm calling infinite difference. You can continue to work on the mode of creating difference. On the other hand, there was this assumption that in fact actually in India you can very easily lump people. Right? So what was one of the major modes of lumping? You divide all Indians into two categories: martial races, non-martial races. That's a process of lumping. Either they're people who are genetically fighters in some sense, or warriors, and these are the people we're going to trust later on. That's what the British view is going to be, because if you're a martial race, you display characteristics of masculinity, chivalry, so forth and so on, right? And then if you're the non-martial race as well, you're weak, you're effeminate, deceitful, right? So forth and so on. That's the lumping. You lump all Indians. I mean, you're not talking about 30 students in the classroom that we're talking about lumping into two groups. You're talking about lumping 100 million people. And you say, you're either all martial races or you're all non-martial races. Right? So this anthropological modality, giving you little instances of what's happening here, is like all the other modalities based on certain conceptions of knowledge that the British have, right? And finally, now, so just to reiterate a few things, so I've already talked about the collective versus individual. The notion of the individual doesn't exist in Indian society according to this point of view, right? And what you do is you create types of people, types of people. This is one of the things that the anthropological modality did as well. What is a very good illustration of that? The People of India project, launched in the circa 1860. Now, if you look at this is an 8-volume work, okay? It's an 8-volume work. And what it does is it gives you types of Indians. It enumerates about 400 types. So when we say types, what do we mean? What we mean is, this person is a representative specimen of the vegetable seller. This person is a representative specimen of the Brahmin. This person is a representative of X, Y, or Z. These are types. There is no individual. Very often, by the way, when the British would have these photographs of Indians in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, if you read my introduction, you'll see I talk a little bit about that. They don't identify the individual. They're nameless. They're simply a Brahmin from Coorg, a Brahmin from Maharashtra. That's a type of an Indian. All right? And behind all of this is what? If somebody asked me in one word, what would I say the whole colonial project sociology of knowledge? Of course, we'd have to then elaborate, as I have in the course of this lecture and my previous lecture. But what would that one word be? Facts. The British are in pursuit of facts. It's a regime of facts. And one of the best illustrations of that, one of the best examples of that, I recommend this novel even otherwise, is by Charles Dickens, a novel called Hard Times. So in Hard Times there is a school inspector. His name is, appropriately enough, Gradgrind. Gradgrind, right? So what does this school inspector do? He's a school inspector, so every day his task is he goes to a different schools to ensure that standards are being maintained, right? And very often when the school inspector goes, you know what typically the school inspector will do? He'll pick on a boy, right? So he'll say, "Oh, Henry, what is the definition of a horse?" And Henry says, he gets up, and Henry says, "A four-footed animal swift on its feet." And what does Gradgrind do? He walks up to Henry and says, "You knucklehead." And he hits him on his hand with a ruler. Corporal punishment was quite common, of course, in those times, right? "You knucklehead, that's not a definition of a horse. there are 50 other animals that are swift on their feet and are four-footed. And he says, I want facts, my boy, I want facts. That's not a fact. And so then, Thomas, what's a horse? And then Thomas will say, a four-footed animal swift on its feet with 32 teeth. Right? And he'll say, that's an improvement, but you too are a knucklehead. Why? What kind of teeth? How many are molars? How many are grinders? That's facts. And constantly Gradgrind says, I want facts, my boy, I want facts. It is, of course, grounded in this British empiricism, right? That accumulation of facts, and then, of course, you need theories about how to organize your facts, right? You need theories of how you're going to organize your facts, what systems of classification you're going to use, what is the epistemological underpinning of these systems of classification. Because all systems of classification rely upon a certain epistemology. Why do we classify things the way that we do? Right? And yeah, I want you to think about it, because we often have naturalized it. We say, well, there's a certain way in which we organize societies. And what are we speaking about here? Why should we organize societies according to whether people are martial or non-martial, or whether they are certain type? Do we reinforce the very categories that we want to actually do away with? Right? So this is what I think you have to think about when we're thinking about the colonial sociology of knowledge. Right? There's this whole set of modalities, whole sets of apparatuses by which the British sought to gain an understanding of Indian society. They, of course, to some degree instrumentalized it. Some of the modalities were clearly modalities which were intended to enlist, intended to assist the British in being able to rule the people, govern them, and obviously tame them, domesticate them, defang them. But in totality, I also want to say that the sum of the knowledge that is produced, right, and this is where we go back to Orientalism, because of course if you looked at the thesis of Orientalism, then you would say, yeah, but this doesn't really tell us anything about India at all. It tells us more about the people who came up with these systems of classification. It tells us something about the European intellectuals, the British intellectuals and scholars and administrators and their mindset. What is the worldview that they had? But I think that from the late 18th century to the late 19th century that we're talking about, a 100-year span, I don't think that one can think consistently only of Orientalism. One would have to understand the assumptions that went into this, okay, colonial sociology of knowledge. But what is interesting to my mind is also the fact that there is this massive corpus of work, which is far greater for India under the British than it is for any other colony, right? Whether a British colony or a French colony or a Dutch colony, which is not to say that other European colonizers were not producing bodies of knowledge about the people that they were colonizing and ruling. But what the British were able to achieve in this sense in India is of a different magnitude. All right? So that brings us to the conclusion of this particular segment. I'll take one or two questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next segment. And that has to do with the social life of the British. Yeah, Vasi.
It seems that there is a dearth of Indian sources to kind of
yes.
compare like the British writings with. So
there is, absolutely. Yeah.
If it weren't for the British,
yeah.
we know of, colonial, it became colonial India at that time because the British were there, but would we know of India, or what would we know of India? And this is like a what-if question. So.
Well, you see, okay, so, but this will vary from realm to realm, because histories, for example, Indians are going to take to what you might call history writing in the 19th century. and there's a substantial body of work now on how the ascendancy of thinking historically, okay, the ascendancy of this view can be documented. So that in Bengal, for example, we can say that by the 1830s, 40s, certainly by the second half of the 19th century, histories are going to start to predominate. Right? However, if you're looking at, for example, something like mapping, I had already suggested in my remarks on mapping that there are indigenous epistemologies of mapping, but they're quite different. The question that, in a sense, that we would have to ask is not whether Indians produced a body of knowledge of this kind at all, or whether they were capable of producing such a body of knowledge. All right. The question really is, number one, how do we understand the epistemological assumptions behind this body of knowledge, right? Why is it that, so if you look at caste, it's a system of classification. So clearly, classification has always been important in Indian systems of thinking. I mean, in fact, if you look at a text such as, you could say that in fact there was an obsession with systems of classification in Indian thinking. If you look at the Kama Sutra, the manual of love making, the incredible detail in which the author is going to describe sexual liaisons and possibilities, right? It's a system of classification. Right? And you're going to find that obviously there's very detailed work that is being done in domains such as linguistics, theology, so forth and so on. But if I had to rephrase the question, and I think it's an important question, much of this is a body of knowledge that we might call social. Right? It's social. What is the social world around us? What is the social world around us? And of course, there are questions such as, well, was this a disinterested effort on their part? But these are questions that I've visited before, right? What is the Enlightenment impulse? What is this idea that we have to be able to know everything? Right? So forth and so on. But certainly you're going to, and if you're asking again, I mean, again, something I've hinted at, that behind all of these enterprises, there's a large number of Indians. Right? Who gets to be the author of a text is very different than who is working to produce it. Right? So the production of many of these things was in fact a collective enterprise. But nonetheless, when I speak about something like the regime of facts, what I'm speaking about is an empiricist epistemology, and that is very much something that you find in English philosophy. All right, so that would be one way to very briefly look at the question that you've asked about. Okay, Lorenzo, I'm going to have to forego any more questions now because I really do want to get onto this segment of the course. Think of this as the lull before the storm. Right? Because here we're going to be looking at, well, what are the British? What is the nature of their social life in India? And then we're going to move to the 1857-58 rebellion. Right? So this is the lull before the storm. Now I have addressed this question when I was talking about Dalrymple. When I was talking about the 18th century, I addressed some segments of this question about the nature of social interactions between Indians and the British. And I've also mentioned to you in other contexts as well, and the point is worth reiteration, that the contact that the British had with Indians was largely with two categories or two classes of Indians. One was the aristocratic elite, the Maharajas, the native princes, the native rulers, right? And the second, and that is by far the larger social domain in which the British operated was interactions with people who were servants. Right? And that's, I think, the best way to describe that group of people. They're people who are servants in various capacities, people who are, so in the retinue, household retinue of a major English, merchant or a member of the ruling elite would include 30, 40 people very often. And that would include, the housekeeper, the butler, the ayah. The ayah is the woman who is looking after the young children of the English woman, right? The cook. And there are all kinds of interesting questions and complications here, which I will only give you a hint. I was speaking to a student who had come into my class, last week. I was talking about say, the cook in the household. Okay. Now, in most Hindu households, if you kept a cook, the cook would always be a Brahmin, a member of the upper caste. Okay, because food is very often a source of contamination. In a strictly Hindu household, for example, you do not ever walk into the kitchen with your shoes. You always keep footwear outside, right? Meat and non-meat dishes will always be cooked in separate utensils. Always in separate utensils, right? So if you are a strict vegetarian, it's not just that you have to be careful that you don't imbibe any, meat or fish or beef broth or chicken broth. You have to be sure that the food is not cooked in the same utensil in which you had cooked a meat dish before. There are very strict rules that govern all of these things. If you were operating in this world of a observant, Orthodox Hindu, all right. And again, you might think, oh, this is particular to India. No, it's not particular to India. Rules of commensality. Black people and white people never shared a meal. I mean, I have to remind you that in the Deep South, okay, during the time of the Jim Crow laws, when segregation was the norm, one of the first initiatives of the civil rights movement was to do what? To desegregate lunch counters. Lunch counters. All right? That was the first of the major initiatives. After the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and all of that, desegregating lunch counters at places like Woolworths. Who you eat with and who you don't eat with, this is always very important. Who do you share your meal with? It's an extension of this now that we're looking at in the Indian context. So the cook that the Englishman kept, the Englishman is insensitive to it. He keeps a cook who is not a Brahmin. Well, it can actually create a storm within the house, because all the other servants are also going to have a problem, right? So forth and so on. So you can get into all of these enormous details if you're interested in it. But what I want you to think about is the general picture. The general picture is that when we're thinking about the British and their social life in India, we're saying, well, one class of people that they had interaction with was the aristocratic native elites, the princes, men of considerable status and wealth, more broadly speaking. And the second class of Indians was the servants, whom they commanded, right? Whom they commanded. These were people who were hired to obviously make British life in India comfortable, right? And there were certain institutions such as the clubs, which became important social institutions for the British. Indians were not permitted in these clubs. So there was obviously an element of racial exclusivity, which persisted almost, by the way, until the end in 1947. And here's a question for you, right? And you'll see what I'm getting to. Do you know what the largest item of export, anyone, was from the United States to India in the first half of the 19th century? the largest item of export. In 25 years that I posed this question in classes or in lectures elsewhere, not one person was ever, unless they had heard it before from, yeah.
Do we get a hint as to what it is?
Huh?
Do we get a hint as to what it is? It's like edible?
Juniper bear?
What?
Juniper bear?
Okay, another guess?
It's either tobacco or cotton.
Ice. Ice.
Ice?
Yes.
Wait, how?
And that's where I get to the gin and tonic.
Wait, I'm so confused.
Ice. The largest item of export. If you've never read Henry David Thoreau, one of the great writers, American writers, read a book called Walden, a masterpiece of American literature. And there's a couple of passages there. Of course, he doesn't tell you it's the largest item of export, but you understand. So you see in India, hot, the British found it very hot. Everyone finds it very hot. The British found it insufferably hot. And there's no refrigeration. Remember, at this point in time, there's no refrigeration. And you want a cool drink. Where do you get your ice from? Hauling it from the Himalayas is very difficult. You remember in Delhi, for example, Delhi is in the plains, the Gangetic Plains, Calcutta. In Calcutta doesn't even have a winter. When it gets to be 70 degrees, they start putting on their sweaters thinking it's real winter. They have to go to Minnesota to know what winter is, right? There's no winter there. There's no ice. So in New England, ponds that would freeze in the winter, they invented these machines that would cut out huge blocks of ice. It has to be very large. Why do they have to be very large? Because it's going to take several months before it gets to India. If you begin with a piece of ice this small, in 2 minutes it's gone, right? So it has to be very, very large, right? And by the time, and then you have to, take care of it. You have to wrap it up in these sackcloths and everything. By the time it gets there, right, that piece of ice has shrunk, but it's still there. And the gin and tonic was invented in the clubs in India, right? This is how, of course, the British gave themselves solace and comfort for being in this infernally hot and miserable country, right? That's how they thought, well, at least let me cool down with a gin and tonic. You cannot read a novel written about the British in India, such as E.M. Forster's Passage to India, which you are reading for this course, or George Orwell's Burmese Days, or any of the novels of John Masters, without running into a gin and tonic at the club, right? That's partly the story of the British in India. Okay, now when I speak about British institutions, so what are we speaking about here? We're speaking about a set of institutions that the British created as well. So one is a set of interactions. Who did they interact with? And when I say who did they interact with, if you look at this, for example, so here is an English woman being carried by on a palanquin, right? A palki. That's what it is, and she's been carried by 4 Indians. Okay, so this is the interaction that the British have with the Indians. They are the servant class here, right? You can see that very clearly. I'll turn to this slide later on. Here's a British tea party, and you notice the Indian bearers on the left, the 2 Indian bearers on the left over there, right? These are people who are obviously attending to the British, who are having this tea party here. And here it is, this caption is wonderful, Mummy and her tiger, right? This is a postcard sent by an English woman to her daughter back in India, right? So she's just shot at this tiger, she's got this rifle. Tiger hunts were extremely, extremely common. All right, and here there are a number of these images that were generated. This is typically how a tiger hunt would take place. There's no, don't think of this as, oh, this is real chivalry. No. You're sitting on top of a howdah, on an elephant there. You're standing there in this, sort of wooden container. Essentially mowing down the tiger population. The number of tigers that you bagged, this was all a mark of glory. All a mark of glory. And if you read some of these records from the 1860s until the 1930s, you find that on a given day, several hundred tigers might be killed. Several hundred. The tiger population of India diminished enormously. And I'm not saying it's only the British who did it, because the native rulers did it too, right? That's what they're doing with the native rulers, right? And here's another representation of this tiger hunt. But this is again one of my favorite images, because you see, look at the kind of pride with which this couple is standing, right? This is our trophy. This is our trophy. I'm not, thinking about things like, natural diversity, ecological awareness, those are lofty things. No one's thinking about that. Certainly they're not thinking about it at this point in time. But essentially, you also have to find a way to interpret images like these. It's first this problem, which is a problem of human civilization down to the present day. And that is this idea of the dominion of humans over the animal world, over non-humans, right? That is the heart of the ecological crisis in the midst of which we are placed today. Right? But it's also, you have to think of it about, you see that this couple, it's like, a British landscape painting of the late 18th century, where the man or the couple is standing and they are the masters of all the land that they are looking at. Because that's what land is for. It's for man to exercise dominion over it. That's the view. This is an extension of that view. Right? But we are not really looking here at that fundamental set of political, philosophical, ethical problems that arise from this. We're looking at it, although for me that's an important set of considerations, of course, we are looking at it from the point of view of when we speak about what was the nature of the interaction with the aristocratic native elite. That's what I'm speaking about. They would go on tiger hunts. This is the way in which they interacted. And there were other sports, such as pig sticking. Polo, of course. Polo was a major one, right? And India still, among some of the old aristocratic elite, it's still commonly played. But those were the forms of entertainment for the British. So one is this set of questions, interactions with natives and interactions with the aristocratic native elite. Then there's a second set of questions. What were the kinds of social institutions created by the British in India? Why did they create these institutions? One of the reasons, and when I say institutions, what am I talking about? I'm talking about clubs, boarding schools, hill stations. 3 illustrations of the kind of social institutions created by the British. Right? Clubs, obviously, because it was a place where the British could engage in conviviality with members of their own race. They didn't have to worry about Indians. Of course, Indians were always there in the clubs, but only as servants, as bearers, as butlers, as cooks. Right? The only capacity in which an Indian could be present in a club was in the capacity of a servant. Right? But the larger picture, before we turn to boarding schools and hill stations, is the idea that you try to make this hostile environment hospitable to yourself. You make yourself comfortable in it. You try to recreate it in the image of England to the extent possible. This is, of course, something that was done spectacularly at hill stations. And hill stations have a long history. There were many reasons why the British went to these hill stations. If you look at this slide over here, you can see so this is hill stations. The bulk of them, this is a relatively recent slide. Some of these hill stations have been developed in more recent years, but the bulk of them had already been developed by the British in India. The bulk of them are obviously in the north. And if you look at the top left over there, so this is all north of Delhi, right? All north of Delhi, and in order to understand the hill stations, one of the things you should also understand is the distinction that the British made between the plains. This is what are the plains, right, and the hills. The plains were obviously very hot, but there were also places where the British were afraid they would catch diseases. Okay, and it was very common, particularly in the 19th century, when the numbers of English women began to increase. Recall that in the 18th century there were very few English women. The men had come out on their own, and they would usually stay there on their own. But as British rule gets consolidated, right, and the foundations of British rule become more stable, a certain element of domesticity obviously becomes important. So there are going to be more Englishmen who are going to bring wives with them. Sometimes there were, of course, matching games, as it were, that would be played out in India itself when the numbers of Englishmen began to increase, right? So they developed these hill stations because these were places where you could escape the heat of the plains, right? And as I said, a sharp distinction between the hills and the plains, but also this distinction was not simply one of weather. They believed that the hill people had a different mentality, different characteristics, that these were people who were sturdier, nobler in a general sense, without looking into the differences between different hill groups. Right? As a general observation, I'm saying there were certain conceptions that the British had about these. TB, for example, tuberculosis was a common problem, and one of the remedies that was always prescribed was go to the hills. Sanatoriums, right? And people who were not keeping well and were mentally not well, all right, well, maybe you should go to a place that's cooler, more relaxing. You go to the hills, right? And I've written a long article on hill stations, and one of the things I point out is that in a way there is a kind of a Christian theology at work as well. Think about hill stations. So I always think about stations of the cross, right? So you go to one station, then you go to another one, you go to a higher one, all right? And there's also this element of sacrifice as well, right? Because of course, in some sense, life was more difficult in the hill stations. You didn't have the whole retinue of people that you had in the plains with you, right? You had to dislocate yourself, so forth and so on. Right? But what do they do at these? So these hill stations are generally, the lowest altitude would be about roughly around 5,500 feet. Okay, roughly around 5,500 feet. The highest would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 9,000 or 10,000. Leh there is actually at 11,000, but that was not really developed by the British. I mean, you find that's become a more popular spot in recent years, but last few decades. But the places that they developed were places such as, if you look over here, Ranikhet, Nainital, Mussoorie, and so on. And these are all roughly, as I said, at an altitude of about 5,500, 6,000, 7,000 feet. Some in eastern India. In eastern India, the interesting thing is, if you look at Darjeeling over here, I'm sure that you're familiar with Darjeeling Tea, that eventually, and this is a story which we're going to turn to later on when we look at the section on the economy, they're going to start growing tea in places, in some places in the northeast, including Darjeeling, which is a hill station. And you've got some over here, because this is not a topographical map, so you cannot see the altitudes here, but this is where what are called the Western Ghats are, the Western Ghats. So you do have mountains over there as well. Nothing, of course, of the altitude that you find in the Himalayan range over here. And in these hill stations, so you also have a lot more greenery. And remember, the England, for those of you who've been there, is very green for the most part, right? Very, very green. And what they would do is they would also create sort of gardens, both in the plains, but in the hill stations especially, right? So the idea was you transform these Indian landscapes so that they begin to look something like Britain, you know, and colloquially speaking, it's you increase your comfort zone. And so the three institutions that we're looking at are the hill stations, which I've talked about, places of retreat, escape, think of escape from the summer heat, a place where you recuperate, right, where you might get possible relief from TB or consumption. Secondly, clubs, and third, boarding schools. Boarding schools. Right? Now, these boarding schools become more common as we move into the second half of the 19th century, because again, once you have a substantial number of Britishers there with their children, now these are people who are settled down. And you can divide the Britishers, by the way, if we want to do the splitting and lumping kind of exercise. So you've got the official British and you've got the non-official British. What do I mean by that? What I mean very simply is those Britishers who were there in their private capacity as merchants, as traders, as businessmen, right? Or in some other capacity of that kind. These are the non-official British. The official British are those who are actually members of the Indian Civil Service or members of the Indian Police Service or working for the government of India, the government of British India. 1857, after 1857-58, it's the government of British India. Right? So these are the official British. And there is a hierarchy, by the way, between the two. Just as there is a very sharp hierarchy, something we haven't even touched upon because, again, it's a very large subject. There's a hierarchy between the British and Anglo-Indians. Anglo-Indians, right? So Anglo-Indians were those who very often were people who had an English father and an Indian mother. You know, where did they belong on the social hierarchy? Right? And you find that the racism that was exercised against Indians was very often inflicted upon Anglo-Indians as well. Sometimes worse, because they were viewed as having been apostates, as having sort of betrayed the ruling class. Right? So boarding schools now are, what are they? They are basically nurseries of the ruling class. The nurseries of the ruling class. These are places where you generate a body of schoolboys. Eventually there are going to be some boarding schools for girls as well, but the bulk of them are for boys. And boarding schools were almost always single-sex schools, you know. All right? They were not co-ed schools. And so this is where you would ensure that a young English boy was receiving the education that would equip him to follow in his father's footsteps, become a member of the ruling class. This is what I mean when I speak about nurseries of the ruling class, in a place that offered you some refuge, some shelter from the Indian masses as well. Right? So these are major institutions: clubs, boarding schools, hill stations, and then, of course, what you find is a whole set of British sports: polo, pigsticking, cricket. And some of you may well be aware of the fact that cricket, which was introduced by the British into India, has in many ways now become an Indian game. In fact, it's more Indian than British at this point in time. There's an extraordinary book which I'm going to recommend to you if you ever want to look into cricket. It's called The Tao of Cricket by Ashish Nandi. And it's an extraordinary exploration of the institution of cricket, how cricket came into India. Its trajectory is very similar. How is it very similar? In England, cricket was played first in the grammar schools, in the boarding schools, and at Oxford, at Cambridge. It was a game for the elite. What was the game? And that distinction, to some extent, of course, this distinction is not as true as it used to be. What is the English game for the masses? Soccer. Exactly. Right? So in India, when I speak about the parallel development, what does this mean? The parallel development means the people who took up cricket in India were initially the princes, the native princes, the aristocratic elite. They're the ones who took up cricket, partly because it was a game of leisure, a game of leisure. If you don't know cricket, remember that until this game was adapted, quote, to the modern age, until about 20-25 years ago, the only format in which cricket was played was what is called a test match, and a test match takes place over 5 days, and there is a rest day in between. And at the end of those 6 days, if it goes into the 5th day included, and then the rest day, it might end up in a draw. Can you imagine an American sport where they would even tolerate the idea of a draw? There have to be winners and losers, always. That's why you keep on going into overtime, always. You know, right? Think about it, right? Every major American sport, right? Football, if you watch the NFL game, you know, historic, right? Why? Because it went to, you know, overtime, right? Every major American sport must end with a winner or a loser. Now, that was not the culture of cricket. You could end up with a draw. And test matches very often ended in a draw. That tells it's a huge difference there, right? If you think about its implications. Yeah? But this was a game brought into India by the British. All right? And its development was parallel. All right, so I'm going to stop there. And in my next lecture, I'll take up the last point here, which I've talked about before,